Okay, so with that, we'll go ahead and turn it over to Nick Dranias.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Representative Mesnard, our sponsor on HB 2305, thank you so much for this opportunity. Folks, let me just emphasize, this is not an abstract operation. This is not sort of a think tank, pie-in-the-sky approach to our runaway national debt. Georgia's Judiciary Committee just passed the counterpart bill by voice vote, and I'm told without any opposition, even from the Democrat Party. It is now heading towards the floor in Georgia. We do not perceive significant problems thereafter. So this is very real. Alaska has me coming out to provide expert testimony next week. I'm going to Juneau on Tuesday. I'm expecting that Arkansas will be dropping the bill next week as well. This is gathering momentum. This is a historic opportunity to fix the national debt. And as a father of 2 children, and I'm sure many of you have children or grandchildren, this is absolutely essential to the well-being of our future. And we would be remiss if we looked back on this day 30 years from now, surrounded by the shambles of an Argentina-style collapse, and wish we took the action that we needed to take. So that said, let me just emphasize at the beginning, I'm going to explain the compact. We've been presenting on Article 5 at the Goldwater Institute now for almost 4 years running. This committee has every single time supported and voted in favor of an Article 5 effort. This particular Article 5 effort is actually even safer, more certain, easier than any previous one that we have proposed to this committee. And it is my hope that everyone who has supported similar state-originated amendment process efforts would support HB 2305 as well. So if we can move forward to the first slide, please. Members of the committee, Mr. Chairman, our national debt is out of control. It is headed to infinity and beyond. This is not a sustainable trend. And one of the things I want to emphasize is that if you see this sort of trend, this tells you that you have a system problem. This is not a mere political issue. The system is broken. If we go to the next slide. Now, some folks will look at that exponential growth in the national debt and say, it's not adjusted for inflation. It doesn't matter. Today, we are at 107% of the gross domestic product in total national debt. That's where everyone started panicking about Greece about 5 years ago. Now, the difference is the last time we were here, it was at the height of World War II. Unlike after World War II, when we were the only economy left standing, we're not. This is a measure of debt that if it continues at the pace it has gone exponentially for the past several decades, is unsustainable. And worse, because we're not the only economy left standing, you cannot assume we can grow our way out of this. Even more significant is the fact that we've already mortgaged the future. There are, by some estimates, $220 trillion in unfunded entitlement programs. That didn't exist in the 1950s and 60s. This is a calamity waiting, and as you watch the stock market crashing because of the slowing down of the printing of money, think about what this means as the next stage in a potential fiscal calamity. If we go to the next slide. Now, you're going to hear that things are getting better, that the deficit is now shrunk from $1.2 trillion to a mere $650 billion. Any deficit of that magnitude is completely out of whack. It does nothing to stop the exponential growth of debt. It keeps us on the exact same path that Greece and Argentina have been on. If we go to the next slide. And there's some folks out there who think that we can just default on the debt. Follow the road that has been traveled by Argentina, Mexico, Venezuela, and so on. It doesn't work like that anymore. There are too many international agreements. Hedge funds and the legal agreements that enforce their obligations are too sophisticated. When Argentina defaulted 10 years ago, their Air Force One was almost seized by a creditor in Africa. And to this day, there is litigation over their assets in the state of New York relating to their pension funds. And what's more is Argentina is boxed out of entire boatloads of international trade because of this behavior. It has been a complete economic nightmare for Argentina. which started off after the default with the nationalization of their equivalent of a 401k, where they swapped out people's real money and investments for worthless government bonds. Now keep in mind, in the 1940s, Argentina on a per capita basis was more wealthy than the United States. Next. We know this too. No matter who's in charge of Washington, Washington never changes its behavior. And they could appear to tie their own hands, but somehow they find a way around it. Right now, we do not even have the protection of a statutory debt limit in Washington. We have been subject since October to unlimited federal borrowing, and even though the federal statute debt limit will resume on February 8th, it resumes at the level of borrowing that we have seen a spree on over the past several months and ratchets to it. And we know that Washington has deliberately borrowed far more than they actually needed for government just so they could ensure that the new debt limit would be much higher than necessary. So looking to Washington is not the solution. If we can go to the next slide. There's a reason for that. It's the unchecked, concentrated power to incur limitless debt in Washington. Think about it. Washington is an outrageously bankrupt debtor. What does the current Constitution allow for? It allows for that debtor to write his own credit limit. This is an insane concentration of power. It should not be any surprise that you see the exponential growth curve that I started with in the first slide. How could it be any other way? This is a system problem. And it's a system problem because debt enables elected officials to buy votes, in essence. Because they can provide all of the benefits of the spending that they want and shift all of the costs to non-voting future generations with little or no immediate impact on their political careers. That's why 49 states currently have some form of debt limit or balanced budget requirement, either in their constitutions or by case law or by statute. Over 200 years ago, 1798, Thomas Jefferson said that if there were just one more amendment that would take away the power of borrowing from the federal government, that would be enough to restore a constitution based on its original principles. What was true 10 years after ratification is true today. If we go to the next slide. So what is it that is at the heart of HB 2305? HB 2305 is an agreement among the states that would deploy a balanced budget amendment for the United States Constitution. That balanced budget amendment is powerful and plausible. Every component of it poll tests it over supermajority support. It is not meant to be an exercise in abstract reasoning. It is meant to actually succeed, and our time horizon is 3 years or less. This year we hope to secure at least 2 states to organize the compact and create an interstate agency that will then have the job of finding additional members and moving forward. So let's go through the balanced budget amendment so that you can see that it's worth your while and why Georgia passed out of judiciary on a voice vote without any apparent opposition this idea from either party. First, if we could hit the space bar, we have discovered that you can have a non-gameable definition of balance. It's very simple. You restrict spending to cash flow at every point in time. Now you're probably going to say, well, how do you do that? There's cash flow volatility. The taxes come in sometimes they don't. Here's the trick. Next slide. All right, next slide. You have to have a revolving line of credit that you can tap to handle cash flow volatility. With those 2 elements combined in our BBA, you have a non-gameable balanced budget amendment that is fully able to tell us when we're spending beyond our means and to limit the use of debt by current politicians so that our kids and their kids don't feel the impact of our choices. But it doesn't stop there. If we go to the next. Key thing about this constitutional debt limit is it is fixed constitutionally. And unlike the current system, the debtor does not get to set his own credit limit. The federal government has no power independently or exclusively to raise its own debt limit as it has or to eliminate it. Instead, any proposal to increase the debt limit requires a referendum of the states. A simple majority of the states have to approve that. And keep in mind that this is the sort of structure we usually entrust our school boards with. We don't trust our school boards with issuing new bonds without a referendum, and yet we have the federal government doing this on a daily basis. If we can go to the next. But you know, you're probably going to say, and some folks on the other side of some of the aisles around here might say, well, then we get this game of chicken from debt limits. Oh my God, you know, you go to the midnight hour, you threaten the credit rating of the country, and it's all just ignored anyway. It's not hard to avoid that, and we've built into this amendment a very simple process. As soon as you are borrowing within 2% at 98% of your current debt limit, the President now will have an obligation, a mandatory obligation, to start delaying spending in anticipation of reaching the debt limit. It's called an impoundment. It's not a new power. It's actually an implied power presidents have always had, although Nixon had some abusive tendencies to use it. The Supreme Court has said that you cannot use impoundment for political retaliation. That is still the case law today. It would still be the case law if this amendment were in place. The President would have to take the politically risky move of designating what would be delayed in order to enforce the debt limit at 98% of the debt limit. That 2% at current burn rates, current spending and tax and borrowing rates, would mean 6 months before a debt limit was reached. This is not going to produce a game of chicken. What it will do is force everyone's cards on the table and start a serious discussion that is transparent, because Congress will have the opportunity to override those impoundments. Congress will have 30 days with simple majorities to propose their alternatives. And we will know who is responsible for the impoundments based on that process. There will not be hands pointing to each other. It will either be the President or it will be Congress. And if neither one acts, because we limit spending the tax revenues, as soon as you hit your debt limit, you have an automatic sequester. And the President could be impeached for doing that. If we can go to the next slide. The other thing we do is we try to avoid the possibility of a tax-mageddon. Some folks out there are concerned on the center right that if you restrain debt too hard, that you will produce dangerous tax increases in the short term. Now let me first take down that issue head on, because we have a moral choice here. Let's not forget that if we intend to repay our debt, that is taxes. Debt is taxes if we intend to repay it. So the idea that somehow restraining debt is not limiting taxes is not true. Restraining debt is limiting taxes. If we don't limit debt, what we are really doing is we're saying we want to tax future voiceless, non-voting future generations for our policy choices. In other words, we are saying if we don't limit debt, we would rather have taxation without representation, a violation of a basic principle our country was founded upon. And if you just look at our country as a mere democracy, basically you're denying the voice of people impacted by this country's decisions in the political process through unlimited debt. So the reality is, debt is taxes. Nevertheless, you could do some really bad tax policy if you swung too far in the way of increasing revenues. So what we've done is we've provided for a requirement that 2/3 of each house, the whole number of each house, by the way, not a quorum, would have to approve any new tax or any increase in any existing tax, but with several exceptions, if you could hit the button. There is an exception for completely replacing the income tax with a end-user sales tax, not a VAT. A VAT is a sales tax at every level of production. It is not a tax on the end user. So if you completely replace the income tax with a sales tax, you can do that with simple majorities. By the way, that can happen right now. In fact, right now with simple majorities, you could have both an income tax and a sales tax. This is an improvement and a restriction on the taxing power that does not currently exist. Another alternative for raising revenue would be to eliminate deductions, credits, and exemptions, what we call loopholes. That can be done with simple majorities. Estimates range up to $1 trillion in revenue that could be obtained by flattening out the tax code that way. And then finally, we don't touch tariffs or fees. So you could raise revenues through those as well. Now some folks might say, well, that's not enough protection from taxes. Think this through carefully in terms of the political dynamics. If you want to get simple majority approval of any increase in revenue, you are forced to run through a narrow gap. You are forced to run headlong into the special interests that currently enjoy both those loopholes and the current level of taxation and the current level of tariffs. Forcing the debate for new revenues to take place head-on with the strong, powerful special interests that want to preserve those loopholes is one that will tend to deny revenues. It won't preclude it, but it will tend to cause deficits to be closed more by spending cuts than by tax revenues. So you have a flexible, fair tax restraint that allows for revenues, that minimizes the risk of wholesale tax-mageddon, and at the same time recognizes the moral fact that it is wrong to tax future generations for our policy choices in the name of maintaining unlimited debt. Next slide. This is just a summary of these major points, because this is an amendment that is incredibly powerful yet plausible. Supermajority support exists for each of these components. I've already emailed the polling data around. If you haven't seen it, I can send it again. There's a pathway to 38 states. But we know this. What do you think the chances are, Mr. Chairman, members of this committee, that Congress would ever propose something like that? 0. Next slide. That's why we're looking to the state origination of amendments under Article 5. Now, I'm not going to go into the original meaning of this yet. That's going to be what I close on. But I want to emphasize one thing in anticipation of the false, misleading arguments you're about to hear after me. The one thing that you should notice about Article 5 is that both amendment powers are in the same sentence. Okay? Both amendment powers, the congressional power and the state power, are also modified by the same ratification clause. If you are a reasonably competent writer of English, if you were intending to describe two fundamentally different kinds of amendment powers, would you write it like this? Or would you be describing the same amendment power exercised two ways? On the text itself, it is apparent that this idea that a convention is somehow this super entity that can just override everything under the sun and do whatever it wants, on the face of the text itself, it is absurd. And let me further emphasize the inherent contradiction of someone saying they're a constitutionalist and yet denying the use of this crucial tool that is in the Constitution. The inherent contradiction of a constitutionalist claiming that the Constitution is so morally legitimate that we should do nothing but enforce it, while saying that it was the product of a lawless runaway convention in Philadelphia. There is no straight-face argument that Article 5 was meant not to be used, that Article 5 describes a weird, super powerful convention process that can be the red button of destruction. There are no serious, consistent, logical arguments, and you can see that from the text itself. If we can go to the next slide. But that doesn't mean Article 5 is perfect. And folks, I want to emphasize the Goldwater Institute supports all uses of Article 5. What I'm about to use as an analysis of Article 5, what I'm about to talk about, should not be construed as in any way saying do not support other Article 5 efforts. But I think it's important to be clear-eyed about how difficult Article 5 is. Because really good patriots thought Article 5, the state origination of amendments, was a ruse, a fraud. George Mason and Patrick Henry both said that Article 5 was so difficult to use, even when there were only 13 states, that it was not really meant to do anything. And what was, his closing argument, Patrick Henry's closing argument at the Ratification Convention in Virginia, what was true then, sadly, folks, and I mean this, we have to look at this clear-eyed, not to say that you shouldn't try this route, but I want you to understand how powerful Patrick Henry's argument is today. If we could hit the button. To navigate the Article 5 process without a compact, without agreeing in advance to all the components in one bill, it will take over 100 legislative acts. It could be as many as 150 if you try to replicate every feature of this compact bill. If you could hit it again. Now, what does that consist of? This is the bare bones process. 34 state applications, it's 34 resolutions. And by the way, in some states you need gubernatorial presentment. Our sponsor in Alaska tells us that you can't avoid the governor. So you need to research each state. Second, you have to have Congress actually respond. Now, they're supposed to respond, but Congress never violates the Constitution, right? But Congress has to respond with a call. That takes simple majorities in Congress. It's another piece of legislation. Then the states presumably have to send someone there, and that takes at least a quorum of 26 states, so you've got to have at least 26 more pieces of legislation. And then, assuming the convention meets and actually does anything, if they propose an amendment, it has to go back to Congress. Congress has to pass another piece of legislation. Again, they're supposed to. It's supposed to be mandatory, but they have to pass another piece of legislation, a resolution, to refer it out for ratification. And then the states have to pass either legislative ratifications, or if they don't already have laws on the structure of the ratification convention, they have to pass laws for the convention and then pass further laws, or at least resolutions sending people to the convention. So Folks, what I want to emphasize here is that this is a very difficult process. And if it was a ruse in the eyes of Patrick Henry and George Mason in 1788 with 13 states, do not kid yourself about the difficulty of this. Now, I believe that with modern technology and communications, this can be navigated. Don't get me wrong. It can be navigated. This still is hard. Next slide. So there's a lot of illegitimate questions about Article 5, but it is fair and just for us to be honest with each other and ourselves to recognize the legitimate problems and challenges of Article 5. First of all, the Friedman-Reagan era BBA effort started in the 1970s. Now, some folks say that there are 20 applications outstanding. I'm not going to get into the details of where that could be challenged, but the bottom line is, even if they're right, we're 40 years into the process and they're still 14 short. And that's just the beginning. We don't even know what the amendment is. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes you need to draft out policy ideas in a consensus-building process. But the point is, we don't know what is going on yet, substantively. And then the last part, the thing that's most challenging about Article 5 is, when the heck is it going to get ratified? Let's assume the best possible amendment is generated. It is completely random and volatile as to when you'd ever get a ratification. You cannot predict. It could be 3 months. It could be 202 years. So, these are legitimate questions, and I'm not saying that you should not navigate the process. You should consider navigating the process. Modern technology, a powerful idea, a powerful movement can overcome these things, but these are challenges. Let's not pretend they're not there. I've been on the ground in many, many states for the past 3-4 years trying to navigate this. It's been challenging. Next slide. But there's a new way to do it, and that's the way that Representative Masnard is advancing, and many of you are co-sponsoring, and that is the compact approach. Now, this is not only safer, it's easier, and it's more certain. The reason why it is you collapse that entire Article 5 process into just two overarching pieces of legislation. One for the states to pass once, one for Congress to pass once. The state compact, if you could hit the button, contains pre-drafted the proposed amendment. If you could hit the button again. It also creates a commission as soon as 2 states join it to help build membership and handle logistics. Hit it again. It also contains the application to Congress required by Article 5. And what we've done with the application is we only make it go live when 38 states, not 34, 38 states join the compact. Why? Because what's the point of doing this if you don't have the numbers to ratify? Assuming that you get to 38 states in the compact, the application goes live. It then, in the counterpart congressional resolution, if you could hit the button, triggers in Title I of a 2-title omnibus resolution the call for the convention. And when that goes out, you get delegate appointments. And when that goes, hit the next one, the delegates' first order of business, or they go home, or are disqualified, or are nullified, is to vote into place convention rules that are specified in the compact that require solely an up or down vote at a 24-hour convention. Period. The end of story. Assuming the convention approves the amendment that is contemplated, then it has further scope limitations that say that no member, not one of the 38 states, can ratify anything else but the BBA that it contemplates. And there are more protections. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Assuming the BBA is approved and referred out, hit the next button. The congressional resolution in Title II of the same resolution triggers, with a conditional enactment, the ratification referral. And when that happens, the preloaded ratification of the compact goes live based on a conditional enactment. Hit the button. Now, whatever you think of the novelty of this approach, there is no question that this is campaignable, plannable. You can, in principle, get it done in 12 months. Now, it's not suited to things that don't show support, supermajority support or fixing everything under the sun. It can't do that, right? But there's no question that this gives you a pathway that is simpler, easier, and more certain for certain ideas, like the balanced budget amendment, maybe term limits. Next. If we could just quickly go through this. If you just hit the button several times. Okay. Let me just, well, not yet. All right. We're cutting the number of legislative enactments down to 39. 38 in the states, 1 in Congress. In and out. You don't have to keep going back to Congress. You don't have to keep going back to the states. You're done. That's at least 60%. If you try to replicate every feature of the compact, it'll be like 80%. One thing that you'll know is that legislators I've dealt with, maybe this is changing with Mark Levin, and this is good, but generally legislators know more about compacts than Article 5. They're more comfortable with it, and that's because the average state is a party to 20 or more. Arizona is a party to 26. We've poll tested the compact weirdness factor. Once you basically explain that a compact is a way of organizing the states to do something more efficiently, more quickly, more easily, more certain, informed citizens favor 2-1. So, you're probably going to say, well, what about Congress? Because there is that dirty little component requiring Congress to pass a resolution. And let's be really honest here, too. Congress is a problem for any Article 5 effort that follows the text of Article 5. And that's because, for wrong or right, for good or bad, our founding fathers decided to give Congress 2 positions of power in the process. It has the power to call the convention. It has the power to refer out the ratification. Now, it's supposed to do those things without any discretion, without any hesitation, without any denial. But as we see, there's some reason to doubt that Congress will do that. And so, in fact, even if, the most dangerous thing about Congress that I see is that we already have seen 2 or 3 bills that have been introduced in Congress to fully structure any eventual convention under Article 5. And to basically make it a mini Congress operating with a lower threshold for proposing amendments. There's a bill that was introduced in the 70s. There's a bill that was introduced in the 80s. So a really clever Congress might respond to a plain vanilla application by saying, hey, that's a great idea. We'll organize it. So the problem is that you have to deal with Congress. You have to game it out. You can't just assume that they're going to do what their job is. And so what the compact does is it masses complete, total domination-style political will with complete tactical flexibility to handle Congress. Hit the next phase. First of all, you're dealing institution to institution with the compact because you have the commission. You're not just a bunch of paper and special interest groups. Next. Secondly, if you think about the yes-but approach of Congress, where they say, yeah, we'll call the convention, just let us organize it, you at least occupy all spaces. You don't let that void be occupied. In all spaces, I mean literally all spaces. Then let's be realistic. This congressional resolution is a problem, but it doesn't require more than simple majorities. There's no presentment. If the political will were to exist to follow the constitutional mandates in Congress, why would that political will not also exist for the resolution? It would. And here's the last and most important feature of the congressional resolution. Because it uses the magic of a conditional enactment, the 2 components, the call and the ratification referral, only go live when they're triggered by the right events in Article 5. You can pass it at any time. I mean, today you could run it through if you saw the votes lining up. You could do it when there's 2 states in the compact. You could do it when there's 20. You could do it when there's 30. The point is you're in, you're out. You have total tactical flexibility. By contrast, without a compact, you're stuck waiting on the states pulling their act together. And then you're approaching Congress at a point where Congress is most threatened. So, bottom line, the compact approach can find the hole in the line. If we can go to the next slide. There's more to it, and I'll speed this up so that we can get to the next presenter. But let's emphasize this too. One of the challenges of Article 5, the legitimate challenges of Article 5, is that you have an unknown product and an unknown process. The compact fully specifies the product, fully specifies the process. We don't unveil it as we proceed. Now, whatever the merits there may be of unveiling things as we proceed, generally, that's not the way to get something done. Generally, you need a plan, you need a campaign. To do that, you need to have actually specific political products, specific political processes. The compact supplies that. But more than that, it keeps the whole convention on target. If we go to the next slide, just hit it once. Hit it again. There you go. We have built into the compact over 16 safeguards to ensure that on the back end, on the front end, in the middle, it is fully safeguarded. In essence, there are multiple kill switches that if this process ever loses its laser focus, it kills it. It shuts itself down. It does nothing. And we can talk about this in the questions in specific detail, but one of the newest things we've added in this bill was a sunset. Some folks said, well, let's say you never pass this in the next couple of years and we don't know what the political environment will be 50 years from now, and then suddenly somebody passes it and you get all kinds of crazy people involved. We've added a sunset that sunsets the compact in 7 years. You can predict generally what the political landscape will look like in 7 years. It should alleviate that concern. So, next slide. Think about it this way. Congress right now is a standing constitutional convention that has total control over its own rules, that can propose amendments not based on 2/3 of the whole number of each house, but on 2/3 of a quorum, which means that you could, in principle, get amendments to completely rewrite the Constitution out of Congress at any time with just simple majorities. Why are we feeling so comfortable about that and so fearful about this? It makes no sense to a reasonable risk-reward assessment. Next slide. So let's talk about history, and this is where I'll wrap up. Because there is nothing that I think has been more misrepresented and misconstrued by the opposition than history and law and the facts surrounding Article 5. First of all, everybody claims on the opposition that the Philadelphia Convention ran away, was illegal, violated the Articles of Confederation. Now, leaving aside the contradiction of simultaneously claiming the Constitution is good, valid, moral, and we must enforce it, and yet it was a product of a coup d'etat. Leaving that aside, I don't know how someone maintains those two ideas in their head at the same time, but leaving that aside, the reality is that if you look at the documents that organized the Philadelphia Convention, it was incredibly broad. It was nothing like this compact. You could easily argue within the scope of the purpose of the Philadelphia Convention that rewriting the entire articles or setting up an entirely new government was entirely authorized. James Madison actually made this point in Federalist number 40. This is not just Nick Dranias. He actually said, guys, read the resolutions. We did exactly what they said. Now, the other argument you'll hear is, well, the Articles of Confederation required unanimous ratification, and the Constitution required 9 out of, instead of unanimous resolution by 13 states. First of all, they're forgetting their history. The reason why Philadelphia Convention was organized is because the Articles of Confederation were in tatters. They were thoroughly breached. They were breached over and over again. That's why there was one convention after another after another. At that time, it was a mere treaty under international law, then as now. When it is breached, is no longer binding. So it really doesn't matter what the Articles said. But even if you think that the Articles mattered to this process at Philadelphia, the fact is that ultimately the Constitution was fully ratified in accordance with the Articles. All 13 states ratified it eventually by 1792. So wherever you look at the Philadelphia Convention, you can feel fairly confident that our country is not the product of a coup d'etat that ran away and is lawless, and now somehow we have to embarrassingly justify the Constitution as somehow good anyway. No, our Constitution was the product of a legitimate process that was fully legal and that addressed real problems, just like the Compact. Next slide. Let me also be clear that when it comes to Article 5, it is absurd to argue that the founders thought it should never be used or that it was the red button of destruction or anything like that. It is absurd because you can read the Federalist Papers, the sales papers, the sales points for ratification. You can read the ratification convention debates. Federalist 43, James Madison, Article 5 equally enables the general, the federal, and the state governments to originate the amendment of errors. Now, it's not just significant that he wrote this because this was his intention. You have to remember the context of the Federalist Papers. This is the representation being made to people who are about to vote for it. It would be fraud for James Madison to say something that was untrue about the product. And even if he did say something that was untrue, it would still be the public understanding of the ratifiers. And legally speaking, if you're an originalist, it would still supply the meaning of the Constitution. Because in the end, it's the ratifiers' understanding that matters. Next slide. It wasn't just James Madison. It wasn't just the Federalist Papers. If you read the proceedings from the conventions that were ratifying the Constitution, you will see people like George Nicholas responding to Patrick Henry saying, Article 5 can be used to be confined to a few points, and it is natural to conclude that those states who apply for calling the convention will concur in the ratification of the proposed amendments. Now, how could he even make that representation, truthfully, if by design and its nature the convention was a runaway convention, if it had intrinsic powers to overrule everything and take over the world? It's ridiculous. Federalist number 85, the final Federalist Papers from Alexander Hamilton. It is entirely devoted to the distinctions between the amendment process and having a new constitutional convention. And its final point is that we can rely on state legislatures to use Article 5 to erect barriers to the federal government. Now, why would he say that if by triggering this red button, it ends the world? It doesn't. It's not true. Let's go to the next slide. Here is the one quote that the opposition to Article 5 uses over and over and over again, and it's fraudulent. It is fraudulent. They use a quote from James Madison in November 1788, where he expresses grave concerns about having a general convention for the sole purpose of revising the Constitution, in response to somebody who asked him, well, what do you think about what New York is proposing at that time? What he was talking about was an effort by anti-federalists in New York and other states, people unfortunately like George Mason and Patrick Henry, to scuttle the product of the Philadelphia Convention and to have an entirely new convention, doing at least 21 different amendments or more. He opposed that. Well, naturally so. He was arguing for ratification. And if you notice, when he says revising the Constitution, the term revise, revision at the time, the usage, and we have in your packet evidence of that, meant the possibility of a total rewrite. To this day, California's Constitution distinguishes between mere amendments and revisions. Revisions can strike at the heart of a Constitution. Amendments can merely tweak. The use of revision means he was talking about an entirely new plenipotentiary convention working on first principles, not under the Constitution. So don't buy this quote. Remember, if you want to know my sentiments on the project of another general convention as suggested by New York, don't let them just quote the bottom half. Next slide. If you have any doubt that James Madison thought that the convention process could be targeted, if you're a fan of nullification, go to the Virginia resolutions. On February 7, 1799, James Madison specifically said that in addition to the remedy of nullification, you could rely on the state legislatures to apply for a convention for the object of declaring unconstitutional the Alien and Sedition Acts. How in the world is that consistent with a view of the convention process that is totally unlimited and doesn't do anything anyone says? It isn't. Next slide. 1830, on his deathbed, he had all the turmoil over slavery, over the Missouri Compromise, all the people claiming states' rights are being violated and so on. What does James Madison say? Well, he talks about specific provisions in his letter, and he says, the final resort lies in an amendment of the Constitution according to a process applicable by the states. Again, what is the implication when he's referring to specific provisions that are having difficulties? And he's saying, apply for a convention. Apparently, he thought, repeatedly so and consistently so, that conventions could be targeted if the states wanted. Now, maybe James Madison isn't enough for you. Maybe Alexander Hamilton's not enough for you. Maybe the representations made at the ratification conventions is not enough for you. Maybe the public understanding at the time of the ratification convention is not enough for you. Here's my last slide. George Washington was the chairman of the Philadelphia Convention. The chairman of the Philadelphia Convention, our first president, a man with integrity to do what we've never seen done, or at least King George thought would never happen, which is to deny the position of king of our country when he had the opportunity, and instead to return and participate as a citizen. He wrote in 1788 to someone who was opposing ratification that if we got it wrong, do not worry, 9 states can get the amendments they want. 9 states was 2/3. 2/3 is the number for an application. George Washington did not tell a lie. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you. Okay, I think that if members of the committee have specific questions specifically about the presentation, we can address those right now, specifically about points of the presentation. If there are questions about the positions that he's presenting that are part of the bill that we're going to move a little bit later on in the hearing, I'd ask you to save that discussion for that point in time when we're going to move the bill and have that debate. But we won't have the PowerPoint presentation up at that time. So again, just questions specifically about the presentation, questions about or debates about the bill. We'll save those for later. Representative Wheeler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nick, thanks. You notice you weren't interrupted once.
I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. Representative Wheeler.
In less than a minute, why can't we elect a Congress to take care of the very problem you're talking about?
Well, I think if you look at Mr. Chairman, Representative Wheeler, apparently we can't. I mean, the proof is in the pudding. And if you look at it, remember, it's a structural problem. Congress has complete control over its own debt limit, and it's the debtor. Imagine if you were running a bank and you had a debtor that demanded and got a revolving line of credit that it got to set whatever it wanted it to be. It would be very difficult structurally to convince that debtor to stop borrowing. And it's the same thing with Congress. The problem is something that, frankly, progressives and classical liberals recognized in the 18th and 19th centuries, to the extent this is not, look, Mr. Chairman, Representative Wheeler, this is not a partisan ideological point. This is a good governance point.
I agree. Absolutely. Good cause, Mr. Chairman. And the debate, yeah, I'm not going to get into it, but obviously something needs to be done. I think the founders, again, it's ironic that we have somehow the intent of the founders of Arizona didn't know what they were doing, but the founders of our country did when we follow the Constitution and compare the two constitutions. But they clearly said the power resides within all of you. Why aren't you replacing these Congress people?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Wheeler, the problem is a structural one. If Congress has the power to borrow from non-voting future generations who in no way can harm their political careers to shower benefits on current voting generations, there is no structural incentive for them to restrain the use of debt. In fact, all the structural incentives favor the unlimited use of debt, and the brilliance of having a fundamental law that restricts debt is it recognizes that fundamental structural flaw. Go back to that first chart. You remember, it's an exponential growth pattern we're seeing. This is not a blip in the political process. This is a system problem. It's a structure problem. That's why you have to reserve a change in the fundamental law, the Constitution. You have to have that because the underlying democracy process does not adequately reflect the interests of non-voting future generations.
Mr. Chairman, and I'll end it with this real briefly. I just want, I think the Congress, yes, it may be, if it's structural, I think greater than the structural problem, and there's always structural problems within any institution, no matter what it is, government, private, or public. But I think what's really happening is that we do have the power, unlike any other nation on earth, to solve a problem which I agree with you is unsustainable. This debt is unsustainable. I think we have common ground. It's not a liberal, progressive, conservative, far right-wing issue. I guess our differences are on how to do this. In 1817, there was enormous controversy in the Congress about the construction of the Erie Canal, which took per ton costs of goods being moved across New York from $100 a ton to $5 a ton. It involved massive deficits in the federal budget. The debate lasted 2 decades. It was built to the incredible benefit of the future generations you are talking about. We often hear from some people that government ought to be run like a business. Businesses need to borrow. Homeowners need to borrow and have a mortgage to have a home and to contribute to their families and to the economy. If we don't have the power to borrow, yes, responsibly, then the government will not be able to do its job. People would not be able to provide for their families, and businesses would not be able to grow. I think this goes way too far, in my opinion, in trying to resolve a problem that I agree with you does exist. And I think we need to, again, get back to really what Washington and the revolutionaries and every veteran since then in this country have died for, and that's your right to vote. And you have the right to change your Congress, and you ought to go and change that Congress. That is the solution, in my opinion.
Thank you for that view. And if we could continue to ask any questions that we do have, and if we could ask any questions that we have now about the presentation, then I would ask you to address those now. And again, we'll have lots of time for the discussion about what our views are on this measure when the bill comes up. I think Representative Smith had some questions, and then Representative Larkin, did you have your hand up? No, and no. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dranias, I have a question on page 2. When you spoke about in sections 2 and 3, when we talk about if Congress, are you trying to find the page? I think it's where you have the whole sections of the bill lined out. So specifically sections 2 and 3. So from time to time where Congress may authorize increase the authorized debt over the 105%. So my question is, that automatically gets kicked to the state legislatures. And from what I read, it's just, by simple majority of the state legislatures. But my question, first one is, the states have to have approval within 60 days, calendar days. And I'm wondering, well, let's see. Are the states compelled in any way to actually hear and to debate that actual request for an increase? Or can they just take that request from Congress and put it in a drawer for 60 days? Or are they compelled to actually hear it and vote it up or down?
Mr. Dranias.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Smith. Actually, no. There is no. The default setting is there will be no more debt unless the states affirmatively approve any requested increase. And so Congress, if it's going to be reasonable, prudent, will probably wait till the states are in session, and will probably make sure that they make their proposals at that point in time. And yes, the states could simply ignore the request. Part of the point here is to have outside intervention by not the immediate debtor. Yes, the states have some reliance on federal funding, but it's really 10, 15% of the budget that is attributable to debt from the federal government. So it's much, much more independent, much more autonomous from the borrowing of the federal government than the federal government itself. And so the bottom line is this. There would have to be a referendum of the states for the reason that you cannot have a structural condition where the debtor is writing his own credit limit. You have to have outside intervention from the organizations, the bodies that are closest to the American people, to better reflect not only transparency in the argument, but also the will of the people, which for 40 years in sustained polling shows supermajorities want debt limited.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Dranias, just one further question. My concern has always been, even if there is such an amendment, that Congress will simply just use Article 1, Section 8 and say, you know what, if this passes, yeah, I know we're supposed to kick our debt increase to the states, and if they don't pass it, we're just going to use a necessary and proper clause and say that it's necessary and proper for this increase, and we're going to go ahead and spend the money or get the money or do whatever. What would you say to that?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Smith, the ultimate backstop for bad behavior by Congress under this system is the bond market. And what this does is it sends up a clear marker of when Congress is actually rendering insecure its own debt. If it disregards this amendment, the bond market will know that there's a good chance that debt will be void ab initio. In fact, if you look at, well, we can't read it, unfortunately, but if you look at your model legislation, you'll see that any issuance of debt in violation of that article is deemed void ab initio, meaning completely unbacked. And, bond markets are jumpy. When we had the Coyotes issue going, and we thought that there was a gift clause problem with the structuring of the financing of the Coyotes purchase, all it took was a letter to Moody's to create some interest in the issue. And, in reality, the prospect of debt on a scale required to operate the federal government being deemed void is enough to at least deter people from buying it, or at least raise the interest rate and thereby deter the behavior by Congress.
Thank you.
All right. Any further questions? Representative Seal.
Yes, Mr. Chair, Mr. Dranias, just to talk in the 30,000, I've got a lot of questions about the substance of the bill, which, as the chairman said, I'll reserve until we're actually on that bill. But in the 30,000-foot view, you talked about the Federalist Papers and the founders and things of that nature. If you were to look at a more strict view of the U.S. Constitution prior to the 17th Amendment, do you think if we didn't have, hypothetically, the 17th Amendment or the situation where popular election of U.S. senators versus the election of U.S. senators by the legislature, do you think we'd be running into a lot of the problems you're talking about here that you're trying to solve with the balanced budget amendment?
Well, Mr. Chairman, Representative Seal, members of the committee, probably so. Keep in mind, Thomas Jefferson in 1798, 10 years after ratification, was complaining about excessive spending and talking about how if we had just one more amendment to take away the power of borrowing from the federal government, we would return the Constitution to its original foundation. So the problem is the structure of unlimited borrowing. As I indicated to Representative Wheeler, as long as politicians can respond to current constituents by shifting costs to non-voting future generations, there is no natural incentive to restrain the borrowing of money. And so the problem is really, respectfully, Mr. Chairman, Representative Wheeler, Representative Seal, what is going on is that there are people who are not being represented in today's political process, and that is our kids. Our kids are not being represented. They don't vote. They're going to be hit with the costs. And so the idea that our current representatives will still take their interests into consideration on an equal basis with those who are voting, I think is frankly not true. And you can see from the graph that, in fact, the system does produce unlimited debt, as one would expect if you had an unrepresented party burdened by the debt and a represented party who benefited from the debt.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Dranias, are you saying this is for the children?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Seal, this may be the one issue. This may be the one issue that is for the children, because the children have no voice, honestly, in this matter. The children are not being represented by the congressman, no matter who is electing them right now. That is a structural problem. It cannot be resolved by saying vote out those guys, because there will never be the same incentive for a congressman to represent the interests of non-voting future generations as strongly as current voting generations. If there were, we would have seen Southern elected officials in the time of slavery representing the interests of slaves. They didn't.
Any further questions? Thank you for your presentation. We will